August 19, 1944, 1400 hours. A requisition chateau outside Le Mans. The map on the wall was no longer a plan, it was a problem. Lines stretched too far east, too fast, too thin. Lieutenant Colonel Loren Ayres stood in front of it. Sleeves rolled, fingers stained with grease pencil, recalculating numbers that refused to obey logic. Patton's Third Army had advanced nearly 400 miles in just over 30 days. 12 divisions, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles. Each mile forward stretched the supply line thinner, turning speed into vulnerability. Behind the lines, depots were emptying faster than they could be replenished. Railroads were still wrecked. Ports were overloaded. On paper, the advance should have stopped days ago. German high command believed exactly that. In East Prussia, Alfred Jodl reviewed the same distances and came to what seemed like an unavoidable conclusion. No army in modern history had sustained such an advance without collapse. Fuel consumption alone made it impossible. A single armored division required up to 150,000 gallons of fuel per day in active operations. Patton commanded 12. That meant nearly 1.8 million gallons daily just to keep moving. And every gallon had to travel 400 miles over broken roads, through destroyed infrastructure, under constant strain. German calculations were not guesses, they were based on hard experience from Russia, from North Africa, from every campaign where logistics had ultimately dictated the pace of war. Armies didn't stop because they lost battles. They stopped because they ran out of fuel. Everything in German military science pointed to the same outcome: paralysis. Their own offensives had stalled for exactly these reasons. Trucks broke down. Fuel ran out. Supply lines snapped. Even the most successful blitzkrieg campaigns eventually slowed, then halted, then reversed. It was a pattern as predictable as gravity. And now the Americans were repeating the same mistake, only on a larger scale. German staff officers calculated that Patton had, at most, 48 to 72 hours before his advance would grind to a halt. They were not guessing. They were certain. But 125 miles away, the reality was already moving, and it looked nothing like German expectations. Engines roared to life in long columns stretching beyond the horizon. Trucks, thousands of them, lined up nose to tail, headlights blazing in open defiance of every rule of wartime movement. No blackout, no concealment, no spacing, just motion. Continuous, relentless motion. Drivers climbed into their vehicles with orders that sounded less like doctrine and more like desperation. Drive. Do not stop. Do not slow. Deliver the load. Turn around. Do it again. The plan, if it could be called that, violated everything the Germans believed about logistics. 2 one-way roads. One for loaded trucks heading east. One for empty trucks returning west. No intersections. No civilian traffic. Military police at every junction enforcing speed, minimum speed. Any vehicle moving too slowly was removed from the road. Any breakdown was pushed into a ditch. If it couldn't be fixed in minutes, it was abandoned. The system would not wait. Within hours, the first convoys were moving. Within a day, they were flowing. Within 3 days, they were unstoppable. German reconnaissance units began reporting something they had never seen before. Not isolated convoys. Not scheduled transport. A constant stream. Vehicles passing every 30 seconds. Then every 20. Then every 10. Engines running day and night without pause. Headlights visible for kilometers. The entire system exposed, vulnerable, obvious, and yet untouched. At first, German officers assumed it was temporary. A surge. A last push before collapse. But the reports kept coming. And they didn't describe strain. They described growth. The numbers started to appear. First week. Nearly 90,000 tons delivered. Over 12,800 tons per day. Each truck carrying 5 tons, sometimes more. Round trips of nearly 700 miles completed in under 24 hours. At any given moment, more than 5,000 vehicles were on the road. The system itself consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel daily just to function. That number alone should have been impossible. German logistics officers did the math again. Then again. Then again. Each time the same conclusion. The system should collapse under its own weight. Fuel consumption alone should exceed supply capacity. Mechanical failure rates, approaching 30% daily, should paralyze movement. Driver fatigue should halt operations. Roads should clog. Bottlenecks should form. None of it happened. Instead, breakdowns became part of the system. Trucks failed 1,500, sometimes 1,800 per day. But they were not repaired in place. They were removed. Immediately. Replaced by others. Mobile repair units followed the columns, fixing vehicles on the roadside, swapping engines in under an hour, cannibalizing damaged trucks for parts. Loss was expected. Redundancy was planned. German doctrine tried to eliminate inefficiency. American logistics assumed it and overwhelmed it with scale. And that was the difference. By early September, the consequences were visible at the front. American armored divisions were no longer advancing in measured steps. They were moving in surges. 40 miles per day. 50. Sometimes 60. Units that should have paused for resupply found trucks waiting for them. Fuel delivered before tanks ran dry. Ammunition arriving before shortages began. The pause, the natural limit of any advance, simply disappeared. On September 1st, one division advanced 35 miles before noon. Stopped. Refueled. Advanced another 32 miles before nightfall. 67 miles in a single day. German planners had never even considered such movement possible. This was no longer logistics supporting strategy. This was logistics becoming strategy. German commanders began to understand, but too late. Reports described not just a supply system, but a transformation of warfare itself. The Americans were not conserving resources. They were consuming them at a rate that would have destroyed any European army, and sustaining it. Fuel depots every 25 miles. Pipelines stretching from Normandy inland. Tanker trucks feeding other trucks. A system feeding itself. Growing while operating. And behind it all, something even more unsettling. Industry. The trucks were replaceable. The fuel was abundant. The drivers, 23,000 of them, could be rotated, replaced, reinforced. Losses did not weaken the system. They were absorbed. For the Germans, every loss mattered. Every truck destroyed reduced capability. Every gallon of fuel lost could not be replaced quickly. For the Americans, loss was a variable, not a crisis. That realization changed everything. Because at that point, the outcome was no longer a question of tactics or leadership or even battlefield performance. It was mathematics, and the numbers no longer worked in Germany's favor. The sound came first. German soldiers along the front began to hear it at night. Low, constant, mechanical. Not artillery, not tanks, something else. At first, they assumed it was movement behind the lines, temporary activity. But the sound didn't stop. It didn't fade. It didn't shift with the front. Continued. Hour after hour. Night after night. Engines. Thousands of them. From observation posts overlooking key roads, reconnaissance units began counting. Not estimating, counting. One vehicle every few seconds. Then faster. Convoys that did not end. Drivers who did not stop. Headlights cutting through darkness in continuous streams, turning entire stretches of countryside into rivers of light. A German reconnaissance officer reported, "Vehicles pass without interruption. There is no gap. We stopped counting after 1,200. The road is still full." That was the moment the pattern broke. Because in German doctrine, everything had limits. Fuel limited movement. Roads limited traffic. Machines limited endurance. Men limited operations. There was always a breaking point. But this had no visible limit. And that was the real shock. It wasn't just the number of trucks. It was what the trucks meant. Each one carried 5 tons. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, medical supplies. Every 30 seconds, another 5 tons. That meant 10 tons per minute, 600 tons per hour, over 14,000 tons per day if sustained. No army in Europe had ever moved that volume continuously over that distance. Not even close. German staff officers tried to understand it the only way they knew how, by finding the weakness. They assumed the roads would fail, that congestion would build, that breakdowns would choke the system. But the Americans had already solved those problems, not by preventing them but by ignoring them. Road blocked? Build another. Bridge destroyed? Replace it in hours. Truck breaks down? Push it aside. Driver collapses? Replace him. Fuel shortage? Send more fuel to supply the trucks that deliver fuel. It was circular, self-feeding, illogical, and yet it worked. By early September, something even more disturbing became clear. The Americans were not slowing down. They were speeding up. German defensive lines, planned around expected pauses, began to collapse not because they were weak, but because they were late. Every calculation was off. Every response delayed. Every counterattack arrived after the Americans had already moved beyond it. General officers began using a phrase that had never appeared in German military writing before. "We cannot catch them." That sentence carried more weight than any battlefield defeat, because it meant the war had shifted beyond control. Meanwhile, at the front, American units experienced something unprecedented. They were no longer fighting against their own supply limitations. They were fighting with excess. Tank crews refueled without waiting. Artillery units fired without rationing. Infantry received ammunition before they needed it. Requests for supplies were not delayed, they were anticipated. One American logistics officer recorded, "We are no longer supplying the army. We are feeding its momentum." And that momentum was becoming unstoppable. But the system had a cost. Drivers began hallucinating after 40, 50, sometimes 60 hours without proper rest. Accidents increased. Trucks overturned on narrow roads. Engines overheated and caught fire. Brakes failed on long descents. Some drivers fell asleep at the wheel and never woke up. Hundreds died not from enemy fire, but from exhaustion. Yet the flow never stopped. Because for every driver who collapsed, another took his place. Because for every truck destroyed, another arrived from the ports. Because behind the system was something even larger than logistics. Industry. Factories in the United States were producing trucks faster than they were being lost. Engines, tires, entire vehicles replaced as quickly as they disappeared. What would have been catastrophic attrition for any other army became routine turnover. German planners had never considered that possibility. They had always assumed that destruction reduced capability. But here, destruction didn't matter, because production outpaced loss. And that changed the nature of war. By mid-September, the realization reached the highest levels of German command. Field Marshal Walter Model reviewed the latest intelligence reports in silence. Supply tonnage, vehicle counts, fuel flow, advance speed. The numbers didn't just look bad. They looked unreal. He read them twice, then said quietly, "This is not an army. This is an industrial process." That sentence marked the turning point, not on the battlefield but in understanding. Because from that moment, the war was no longer being interpreted as a series of operations. It was being understood as a system. And Germany was not fighting a stronger army. It was fighting a stronger system, one that could not be outmaneuvered, one that could not be exhausted, one that could not be matched. By late September 1944, the last illusion disappeared. German command had waited for the moment when the American advance would stall. They had planned for it, built defensive lines for it, held reserves for it. Every operational doctrine they possessed depended on one assumption: that the enemy would eventually have to stop. That moment never came. Instead, reports grew worse. American units were not pausing, they were rotating. When one formation slowed, another moved through it. When one supply route strained, another opened. Rail lines, destroyed during the retreat, were being rebuilt behind the advancing front at a pace that defied logic. Hundreds of miles of track restored while combat operations were still underway. What should have been a breaking point became expansion. German officers began to understand that they had miscalculated something fundamental. Not the numbers themselves, but the nature of the system producing them. They had assumed the Americans were bound by the same constraints. They were not, because the American system did not aim for efficiency. It aimed for inevitability. Every weakness was compensated not by precision, but by surplus. Every delay was absorbed by redundancy. Every failure was anticipated and rendered irrelevant. A truck breaks down? There are thousands more. A bridge is destroyed? Another appears within hours. A route becomes congested? A new one is created overnight. A unit runs low on fuel? The fuel arrives before the tanks stop. There was no single point of failure, and that made the system unbreakable. For German commanders trained in a doctrine of decisive battles and operational maneuver, this was something entirely new. You could outmaneuver an army. You could encircle it. You could destroy it piece by piece. But how do you defeat something that simply replaces itself faster than you can damage it? That question had no answer. At the front, the consequences became visible in the smallest details. German soldiers reported that American artillery fired without restraint. Not measured bursts, not controlled fire missions. Continuous bombardment lasting hours, sometimes days. Each shell represented weight, transport, fuel, coordination, and yet the shells kept coming. In some sectors, American units fired more ammunition in a single day than German divisions were allocated for an entire week. The imbalance was no longer tactical. It was structural, and it was everywhere. Captured German officers began to speak differently during interrogations. Not about tactics, not about positions, about supply, about trucks, about fuel. One officer reportedly said, "You are not fighting the same war as us." That statement spread not officially but quietly, through conversations, through reports, through letters. It wasn't defeat that broke confidence. It was comparison. Because German soldiers began to see things they could not reconcile with their understanding of war. American troops discarding equipment that was slightly damaged instead of repairing it. Fuel being used freely for transport, for heating, even for convenience. Rations being thrown away. Chocolate given to civilians. Things that, in the German system, were controlled, rationed, measured down to the smallest unit. It wasn't just abundance. It was indifference to scarcity. And that was more devastating than any battlefield loss. Because it meant the enemy was not constrained. And if the enemy was not constrained, then the outcome was not in doubt. It was only a matter of time. By October, German command no longer planned for victory in the West. They planned for delay. Every operation shifted from offensive intent to defensive survival. The goal was no longer to stop the Americans, but to slow them down long enough to stabilize the front. But even that proved difficult, because speed, once established, became self-sustaining. The Red Ball Express, originally conceived as a temporary solution, continued for 82 days. In that time, it delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies, moved across more than 120 million ton-miles, maintained by nearly 6,000 trucks and 23,000 drivers, consuming hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel daily, just to keep itself running. And even then, it was only a part of a much larger system. Pipelines, railroads, ports, factories, all feeding into one outcome, momentum. And momentum, once achieved at that scale, could not be reversed. That was the climax. Not a single battle, not a decisive engagement, but a realization. The war had changed. Not in tactics, not in weapons, but in scale. Germany had prepared for a war of maneuver. The United States was fighting a war of production. And in that kind of war, the result is determined long before the first shot is fired. By how much you can build, how fast you can deliver, how long you can sustain. German generals would later describe Normandy and the advance that followed in simple terms. They were not defeated in the field. They were overwhelmed, not by superior tactics, not by better soldiers, but by a system that turned industry into inevitability. And once that system was in motion, there was nothing left to do but endure it. Until the end.